In a failing diner on the brink of shutting down, a quiet, weary black owner is solemnly packing up the last of his things when he spots a homeless mother and her daughter sharing a few crumbs of bread. Without hesitation, he invites them in for a warm meal and offers them a place to stay, just a warmer corner for the night. But what he doesn't know is that this simple act of kindness will end up saving his restaurant. And what happens next will leave everyone stunned. Before we dive in this story, let us know where you're watching from. We love to hear your thoughts. The wind swept leaves down the empty sidewalk of a quiet downtown block, where most storefronts were either shut down or fading into memory. Neon lights flickered weakly above the glass window of Howard's Diner, once a bustling neighborhood favorite. It was early November, cold, gray, the kind of chill that made you feel forgotten. Across the street, a new glitzy restaurant buzzed with music and polished chrome. Carlton's Table, its name glowing in blue-white letters, mocking the rusted red script above Howard's door. Inside the diner, Howard, a black man in his early 40s with tired eyes and a scruffy beard, moved slowly as he stacked chairs, wiped down the already clean counter, and turned the open sign halfway to closed. The place was nearly empty, just one old couple sipping coffee in silence, and a young man with earbuds hunched over his phone. None of them looked up. No one did any more. Howard didn't speak much, not because he had nothing to say, but because he'd learned early that the world rarely listened when it came from someone like him. He grew up without a family, raised by the system, bounced from home to home. No photos on the wall, no holiday dinners, no one ever waiting for him. This diner was all he had. It wasn't just a business, it was his shelter, his anchor. But things had changed. Ever since Carlton's Table opened across the street, his regulars had vanished, lured by glass chandeliers and French menus. Worse, rumors had started circulating that Howard's kitchen failed inspections, that his food made people sick. None of it true, but no one questioned it. Not when it came from Carlton, a well-known white restaurateur with money, connections, and charm. A few nights ago, a man in a suit had even leaned in and whispered to Elijah while paying for coffee. "Why don't you just sell the place? No one wants greasy soul food anymore. Times changed, brother." Then he smirked and walked out. It wasn't the first time Howard had been reminded, subtly or bluntly, that he didn't belong, not really, not in this neighborhood. Not in any. Some customers still clutched their purses a little tighter when he walked by their table to refill water. Others called him boy with a smile and didn't realize how deeply the word cut. The worst was the way Carlton's staff referred to him on social media. The stubborn old cook, clinging to the past. He never answered them. He just kept wiping the counters, boiling stock, and unlocking the door every morning like someone still believed in second chances. But tonight, as he dumped out a half batch of unsold cornbread, even Elijah had to admit, hope was running thin. But outside, near a bench by the alley, something made Howard stop mid-step. A woman, about 35, sat on the cold concrete sidewalk, her coat too thin for the weather. Next to her, a little girl, no more than 7, bundled in a threadbare hoodie 2 sizes too small, holding half a crushed granola bar. The woman carefully broke off a piece and handed it to the girl, then forced a smile, though her hands were trembling. Howard stood by the door, watching. He glanced over his shoulder. No one in the diner cared. Then he stepped outside. "You two eatin' today?" he asked, voice soft. The woman looked up cautiously, her dark eyes sharp, guarded. "We're fine," she said. But the girl looked at the diner window and whispered, "It's warm in there." Howard hesitated. He knew what it looked like. A white man in front of a diner, a mother and child outside. He knew people across the street would be watching. He could already feel Carlton's staff across the way, smirking. Still, he stepped aside. "Come on in. Got some soup I was going to toss anyway." The woman held her daughter close. "We're not begging," she said firmly. Her voice carried pride and pain. "Didn't say you were," Howard replied. "Just saying, I've got too much soup and too few customers, that's all." After a beat, she stood up, brushing dust off her coat. "Marsha," she said, "this is Leela." Howard nodded. "Howard." He held the door for them, aware of the way a couple at the counter glanced disapprovingly as Marsha and Leela walked in. The man muttered something under his breath, something about bringing in trouble, but Howard didn't flinch. He led them to a booth by the heater. As Marsha helped Leela into the booth, Howard ladled soup into 2 steaming bowls behind the counter. He noticed her hands, cracked, raw, but precise in movement. She looked worn, but not broken. Her face, though lined with fatigue, held a stubborn clarity. When he placed the bowls down, Lila whispered a soft thank you, and Marsha gave a small nod. They ate slowly, savoring every bite. At one point, Leela asked, "Why is it so quiet here?" Howard exhaled, looked out the window toward Carlton's glowing facade. "Used to be louder, but times change." Marsha followed his gaze. "That place?" she asked. Howard didn't answer, just offered a small, tired smile. Later, as they finished their meal, Howard returned with a blanket and a key. "If you two don't have a place tonight," he said, "there's a storage room in the back. It ain't much, but it's warm and safe." Marsha looked at him long and hard. She wasn't the type to trust quickly. She'd seen too much, especially from men like him. But she nodded once. "One night," she said. Howard just replied, "That's enough." That night, as he locked the front door, he glanced once more across the street, where Carlton laughed with a wineglass in hand through his bright window. Then he turned off the diner lights, the only soft glow now coming from the back room where 2 strangers slept, and something in him finally felt just a little less empty. The morning sun filtered gently through the diner's front windows, casting soft golden lines across the floor. Outside, the city was waking up slowly. Delivery trucks rumbled in the distance, a few early risers shuffled by with coffee cups in hand, and pigeons pecked at crumbs near the curb. But inside Howard's diner, something felt different. Howard rubbed the sleep from his eyes as he came downstairs from the cramped apartment above the diner. His back ached, the way it always did after a night on that lumpy mattress, but this morning it wasn't the dull pain that stopped him at the bottom of the stairs. It was the quiet. Not the usual dead quiet of an empty place, but a purposeful kind. The kind that follows movement. He looked around. The tables had been wiped clean. Not just wiped, polished, edges aligned. Chairs were tucked in straight. The salt and pepper shakers, usually half empty and misplaced, stood centered and filled. The floor no longer held the trail of footprints he'd grown blind to. Even the little welcome mat near the entrance, frayed and usually crooked, had been shaken out and set straight. He blinked. The diner hadn't looked this put together in months. In the back he heard soft footsteps. Marsha emerged from the storage room, her hair pulled back, sleeves rolled up, holding a damp rag in one hand and a small trash bag in the other. Lila followed, still rubbing sleep from her eyes, clutching a folded blanket. "You didn't have to do all this," Howard said, more stunned than anything. His voice was rough with sleep. Marsha shrugged. "Figured it was the least we could do. We stayed for free. Not everyone would have offered that." Howard opened his mouth, then paused. He wasn't used to this, someone doing something without asking for something back. Not anymore. Lila climbed into one of the booths and curled up quietly, watching them with curious eyes. "It smells better in here," she said innocently, and both adults let out a soft, unexpected chuckle. Howard leaned on the counter, arms folded. "You ever work in a place like this before?" Marsha glanced around. "Not exactly, but I know how to clean. I've cleaned enough kitchens, scrubbed enough plates to guess what goes where." There was pride in her voice, not loud, not defensive, but present. Earned. Howard nodded slowly. He wanted to ask more, but he caught himself. People like Marsha didn't need pity. They needed space. Respect. "I could use the help, honestly," he said instead. "Haven't had a steady hand around here since—" She looked at him, waiting. He exhaled. "Since my old manager left. Took a few recipes, a few secrets, and sold them across the street." Marsha's gaze followed his thumb as he gestured out the window toward Carlton's glowing signage. Him? Howard nodded. Name's Carlton. Flashy type. Bought out 3 spots on this block. Opened up that circus over there with money and arrogance. Then he found a way to convince my cook to jump ship. Took my chili recipe with him. Said it was his all along. People believed him. Marsha's eyes narrowed. You ever call him out? Howard gave a short, bitter laugh. And say what? That I've got a tarnished recipe and an empty booth? Nah. He's got connections, fancy marketing team. I've got a coffee pot and too much pride. He wasn't sure why he was telling her all this. Maybe because she wasn't offering sympathy. She was just listening. Fully, with those sharp, steady eyes. You're not the only one folks look down on, she said, not with bitterness but with recognition. Last shelter we stayed at kicked us out because someone said we were causing tension. Truth was, Lila cried at night. That was enough to make people uncomfortable. Howard looked over at the little girl, now quietly drawing something with her finger on the foggy window. I'm sorry, he said. Marsha shook her head. Don't be. We keep moving forward. That's what we do. A silence settled between them, not awkward, but shared. Howard cleared his throat. You know, if you want to stick around, help out a little, I can pay. What I can, it's not much, but the storage room's yours as long as you need. Marsha studied him for a moment. Her expression softened, but she didn't smile right away. Trust was a heavy thing, earned slowly. You sure? She asked. We're not good for business? Howard knew exactly what she meant. He'd seen it already, just yesterday, the way that couple looked at her like she didn't belong, a woman with nothing to her name, stepping into a diner most folks had written off already. She didn't need to explain. I'm not here to impress the people who never gave a damn, he said quietly. I just need someone who shows up. That made her smile, just slightly. Then we'll stay, at least for a little while. Howard nodded, then moved behind the counter, flipping on the coffee machine. As the warm aroma filled the room, Lila looked up and said, It really does smell better in here, and for the first time in months, Howard believed it too. Not just because the place was cleaner, or because he had help, but because something intangible had shifted. The weight in the air was lighter. The silence, kinder. In a diner once forgotten, 2 strangers who had nothing had somehow started to give something back, and though Howard didn't know what would come next, for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was doing it alone. The rhythm of the diner began to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but like the slow thaw after a long winter. Days passed and Marsha stayed. She moved quietly but with purpose, arriving before Howard turned the lights on, and still wiping down counters long after the last customer had left. She never complained, never asked for more than what was offered, and never said much about her past, but there was something in the way she moved. Measured, intentional, like someone who had once commanded a kitchen far bigger than this one. Howard noticed it in small things. The way she arranged ingredients on the shelf without a sound, the way she instinctively reached for the right pan before he said a word, the way she never wasted anything, not even the scraps. Most of all, it was in her eyes, alert, calculating, always watching, as if she was waiting for something to fall into place. One rainy Tuesday evening, the diner was almost empty again. The kind of night where the rain came down sideways, slapping the windows like it wanted to get in. Howard leaned on the counter, sipping weak coffee, while Marsha swept near the entrance. Lila sat at a booth, flipping through a worn picture book a regular had given her last week. The place was warm but quiet, comfortable in a way Howard hadn't felt in a long time. You eat yet? He asked suddenly. Marsha looked up. Not yet. I was going to make something, he said, standing up, but honestly, I've been making the same 3 things since my cook left, and they're getting sadder by the week. Marsha tilted her head slightly. You want me to try something? He hesitated, not because he doubted her. He wasn't sure why, exactly. Maybe because this diner was the last thing he hadn't fully let go of yet. Letting someone else step behind the stove, even for one meal, felt like cracking a door that had stayed locked for too long. But then he saw Lila curled up, half asleep under her mother's coat, and saw how Marsha looked. Not tired, but ready. Ready to do something that meant more than just cleaning someone else's mess. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Go ahead." She didn't smile. She just nodded and walked into the kitchen like she belonged there. Howard sat back, arms folded, and listened. The sound of pans, measured chopping, a faint sizzling. He'd heard it all before, but this was different. It wasn't frantic or clumsy, it was confident, deliberate, like someone making music no one else could hear. 15 minutes later she stepped out with 2 plates, one for him, one for Lila. She set them down, then returned to the kitchen without a word. Howard looked at the plate. Nothing fancy, just pan-seared chicken thighs, sweet potatoes roasted with rosemary, and a side of collard greens with a touch of vinegar. But the smell. It stopped him. He took one bite and froze. It wasn't just good, it was alive, balanced, rich, somehow familiar but elevated, like something his grandmother would have made if she'd had a culinary degree and a secret stash of spices. He glanced over at Lila, who had perked up and was eating like she hadn't tasted anything that real in weeks. Marsha returned quietly, wiping her hands on a towel. Howard set his fork down. "You sure you haven't cooked in a place like this before?" he asked, not joking. She didn't answer immediately. Then, eyes steady, she said, "I've been in kitchens, not lately." "That's not just being in a kitchen," he said. "That's knowing what a plate's supposed to feel like." Marsha gave a half-smile, almost shy. "Used to be part of who I was." Howard tilted his head. "What changed?" She looked away. "Life did." He didn't press. There was weight behind her words, and he knew better than to ask for the whole story too soon. People only unpacked their scars when they were ready, but as the night went on, the food lingered, its warmth, its memory. The next morning, Howard found himself looking at the menu board and thinking, maybe it's time for something new. That day, he asked her to cook again, just something small, for the regulars. She agreed. It was simple. Tomato bisque with grilled cheese, but the kind that made people pause after the first bite. The older couple who'd stopped talking weeks ago actually shared a smile. A truck driver who usually grabbed coffee and left stayed an extra 10 minutes, and Howard began to notice it, a shift, subtle but real. People were tasting something they hadn't found across the street at Carlton's shiny bistro. They weren't just eating, they were remembering. Marsha never bragged, she let the food speak. But Howard couldn't stop thinking about the hands behind it. How steady they were, how confident. She carried herself like someone who'd been respected once, then learned what it meant to lose everything. One evening, after closing, they sat at the counter. Lila was asleep in the booth, her head resting on her mom's folded jacket. "You could have taken that food talent anywhere," Howard said quietly. "So why here?" Marsha stared into her teacup. Because here someone opened a door, no questions, just soup, just kindness. Howard looked down, then nodded. "Didn't seem like much at the time." "It was," she said, "more than you think." They didn't speak for a while. Outside, the rain had stopped. A few stars flickered through the haze above the city skyline. The diner lights hummed gently. That night, before going upstairs, Howard scribbled something new on the specials board in the window. Social choice, ask inside, and for the first time in months he didn't feel foolish about hoping, because something was changing, and not just in the kitchen. There was fire in the food again, and it came from the quiet hands of a woman who never asked for a second chance. She just made it real. The good days didn't last long before someone noticed. As word spread about Howard's diner coming back to life, customers began to trickle in. Regulars who hadn't set foot in the place for months, new faces drawn by the scent of collards and cornbread, and people who didn't even know why they stopped, only that something pulled them in. Marsha stayed mostly out of sight, working the kitchen with her usual focus, letting the flavors speak, but not everyone welcomed the change. Carlton noticed first. From across the street he watched through his spotless glass windows as customers stepped into Howard's place and stayed longer than they used to. He leaned on his polished counter one Friday afternoon, smirking as one of his waiters reported they'd lost 2 big tables to the diner that week. Carlton didn't take losing kindly, especially not to a man he considered finished. That evening, Howard found a flyer taped to his front window. Thick cardstock, all glossy and clean. Neighborhood Chef Showdown, hosted by Carlton's Table. Public tasting. 1 winner. Loser closes doors for good. He read it 3 times, then tossed it onto the counter, jaw tight. Marsha walked in from the back, wiping her hands. "What's that?" Howard sighed. A trap. She picked it up and read it in silence. "He's challenging you?" "No, he's challenging us." Marsha raised an eyebrow. "Did you agree to this?" "I didn't need to. He's already spreading the word like it's happening. Talked to the Chamber of Commerce, local press, probably paid off half the food bloggers in town." Howard's shoulders tensed. He wants a spectacle. Thinks if we say no, we look scared, weak. Marsha considered that, her face unreadable. "You want to back out?" he said. "I'd understand." She met his eyes. "No, I just don't want to play his game." Howard let out a bitter laugh. "That's all he does. Games, marketing, image, cheap tactics, and now he wants to humiliate us in front of the whole damn block." Marsha's voice stayed calm. "Then we don't play it like he wants. We cook. We cook like we always do." The days leading up to the showdown moved fast. Howard and Marsha prepped carefully, refining simple recipes, testing seasonal ingredients, staying true to what they did best. Honest food with heart. Lila helped where she could, folding napkins, drawing little thank-you notes they tucked into to-go bags. The neighborhood buzzed with curiosity. People talked. They whispered about the woman behind the stove, asked questions Howard never answered. Some assumed she was just some down-on-her-luck home cook. Others, fewer, began to wonder if she might be something more. On the first day of the competition, a crowd filled the public square set up between the 2 restaurants. Tents were raised. Judges, local reporters, influencers, a retired chef, sat at the head table. Howard and Marsha worked silently side by side in their tent, while Carlton strutted under his banner, surrounded by assistants, cameras flashing every time he smirked. The early rounds were close. Marsha's shrimp and grits beat out Carlton's foie gras crostini by a narrow margin. Her roasted chicken with sweet yam puree stole the second round. But Carlton pushed back hard. His truffle risotto and lamb chops dazzled the judges visually, earning him points for flair. The crowd split. Some loved his polished style. Others began gravitating toward the warmth in Marsha's cooking, the way it made them close their eyes and remember. Then came the night before the final round. Howard and Marsha stayed late, organizing ingredients in the back kitchen. The menu for tomorrow was going to be bold. Her grandmother's smoked short ribs with butter beans and pickled slaw. It was meant to end the competition on a note of memory and fire. But when they arrived early the next morning, something was wrong. Howard walked into the kitchen and stopped cold. Crates were overturned. The refrigerator had been unplugged. Bags of produce, greens, ribs, even the dried herbs, soaked or spoiled or missing. He stared at the mess for a long, hard second, then turned and slammed his fist into the doorframe. "Carlton," he growled. Marsha stood still in the doorway, her face unreadable. She walked slowly to the back, sifted through what was left. Potatoes, a few broccoli crowns, a handful of spices in a drawer they'd forgotten to unpack last week. Howard leaned on the counter, his voice hoarse. "It's over. We can't serve this. There's nothing left." Marsha didn't answer right away. She sat down at the prep table, her hands resting quietly on her knees. Then, after a long silence, she said, "It's not over." He turned to her. "With what? Potatoes and broccoli? He's got a full team prepping sous vide duck and whatever else he bribed from a magazine." Her eyes were calm, but her voice was firm. "I can work with this." "Work with what?" She looked at him, eyes sharp. When I was 10, my mother lost her job. We lived off potatoes and boiled greens for 6 months. She used to say, a poor meal cooked with care still feeds the soul. That's what I learned to cook with, not truffles, not fancy names, just what we had. Howard swallowed hard. I'll make mashed potatoes, she continued, now moving toward the stove, but they'll taste like warmth, like memory, like something people forgot they needed. He stared at her, still in disbelief, but then slowly nodded. Then I'll handle the presentation. An hour later, they walked to the tent with a single tray. No garnish, no theatrics, just a plate of golden mashed potatoes, whipped until silky, touched with roasted garlic and a hint of cracked pepper, and a side of simply steamed broccoli dressed in olive oil and lemon. It looked humble. Almost too humble. Carlton burst out laughing the moment he saw it. Is this a joke? You brought school lunch to a food war? Howard ignored him. Marsha stood tall, quiet, composed. One by one the judges tasted. Carlton's dish looked like art. Tiny cuts of duck breast glazed in port wine reduction. Everyone expected a landslide. Then an older judge paused, took a second bite of Marsha's mash, closed his eyes. Then, with a voice hoarse with memory, he said, "This reminds me of home, of my grandmother's kitchen, of hard times, real food." Another judge followed. She covered her mouth after swallowing. I haven't tasted something this honest in years. When the scores came in, there was no debate. The crowd erupted, not in shock, but in something like relief. Something had cracked open. And somewhere, beneath the glitz and ego, the block had remembered what food was supposed to feel like. Howard didn't smile right away. He just looked at Marsha. She didn't beam or gloat. She simply stood there, steady, as if she knew all along. As if this was never about winning a contest. It was about reclaiming something stolen, and for the first time since the fire went out in his diner, he felt it return. Not in the stove, but in the heart of the woman beside him, the one who faced a storm with nothing but a potato and her mother's memory. The sun was setting by the time the crowd began to thin, casting a warm amber light across the town square. The small stage in front of the judging table had been mostly cleared, but the echo of the day's last applause still hung in the air like smoke from a long-forgotten fire. Howard stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching people drift toward the diner across the street. Not Carlton's. His, the one with the peeling paint and the dented door. The one that just a few weeks ago he had almost locked for good. Inside it was standing room only. The handwritten sign on the window, Chef's Choice, Ask Inside, had drawn curiosity at first. Now it drew reverence. Marsha stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled, apron streaked with remnants of mashed potatoes and steam, her calm face focused as she stirred a new pot of soup. She didn't speak much as usual. She didn't need to. Her food had said enough. Her presence said more. Howard leaned against the back counter, watching her ladle broth into bowls. "You know," he said quietly, "I've been in this diner for 20 years. Thought I'd seen everything, slow days, break-ins, even a grease fire or two. But I never thought mashed potatoes would save it." Marsha looked up, lips tugging slightly. "It wasn't the potatoes, Howard." He tilted his head. "No. It was people remembering how to feel something," she said, her voice low but clear. "You gave them that space. I just filled the plate." Before Howard could answer, a voice cut through the murmuring crowd. "Excuse me. Chef?" "Excuse me." A man stepped forward, one of the judges, the older one who had teared up during the final round. He carried a worn leather notebook held tight against his chest. "I didn't get a chance to say this during the announcement, but I wanted to speak to you privately," he said to Marsha. She met his gaze, wary but respectful. "I used to teach at the Culinary Institute of Atlanta," he continued. "Ran their judging panel for the Rising Chef program back in the day." His eyes sharpened. "And I remember a student named Yvonne Marsha Lattimore, quiet, brilliant, could turn 5 ingredients into gold, until one day she disappeared from the industry. Scandal, they said. But I never bought the story. The diner fell into silence. Even Lila, wiping silverware at the back table, looked up. Marsha didn't blink. That was a long time ago. He nodded. But the way you cooked today? That memory came rushing back. You haven't lost it. In fact, it's deeper now, like you've been through the fire and came back with something no culinary school could teach. Howard looked at her, stunned. He opened his mouth, then closed it. It all made sense now. The precision, the silence, the sadness that hung around her like an apron. I lost everything, she said finally, voice barely above a whisper. My reputation, my job, my home, all because someone doctored a financial report and pinned it on me. I didn't fight back. I didn't have the means. Just packed up and kept my daughter safe. That was the only thing that mattered. The judge stepped closer. And yet you stood here today and reminded an entire town what food is supposed to do. She didn't respond, just offered a small nod and turned back to her soup. But in her eyes, for the first time since she stepped into the diner, something flickered. Not pride exactly, something softer. A kind of quiet reclaiming. A few days later, Carlton's restaurant shuttered with little ceremony. The headlines were blunt. Arrogance doesn't cook well. He had tried one last smear campaign, suggested the competition had been rigged, but no one listened. The people had already chosen their story. And it wasn't his. Business at Howard's Diner picked up steadily. Not because of flashy advertising or a 5-star menu, but because people left feeling full in a way that had nothing to do with calories. On a cold December morning, Howard came down the stairs to find Marsha already at the stove, humming a quiet tune as Lila sat in the corner coloring Christmas trees. He poured himself coffee, looked out at the window where a line had already begun forming outside. Then he glanced at the small flyer by the register, one that Marsha had typed up the night before, its corners held down by salt shakers. The Hearth Fund, a community kitchen for those who need it most. Hot meals served every Wednesday, free of charge, no questions asked. Howard smiled. "You sure about this?" he asked. Marsha turned from the stove, wiping her hands. "They helped us when we had nothing," she said. "Now we help someone else." That afternoon, a mother with 2 kids came in from the cold, unsure of where to sit. They were hesitant, clothes thin, eyes tired. Howard stepped forward, waved them in with a smile, and brought out bowls of hot potato soup without waiting for a name. As they ate, the younger child paused, then whispered, "This tastes like the food Grandma used to make." Marsha heard it. Her hands paused for just a second before she continued chopping. She didn't speak, but her eyes shimmered slightly. She had heard it before, and every time it meant the same thing. Howard stood behind the counter, arms crossed, and watched the people, real people, filling his diner again. It wasn't just a business anymore. It was a place where something had survived, grown. He turned to Marsha. "Guess we're partners now." She gave him a sideways glance. "Guess so. And don't think I didn't notice you still didn't put your name on the specials board." "I don't need it there," she replied simply. "But maybe it's time we put something else up." The next morning a new sign appeared on the door. Fresh paint, bold letters, but no flashy slogans, just one sentence. "Home is a plate passed with love." No one knew who wrote it first, but everyone who walked in understood exactly what it meant. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.